This is Dale Maharaj. After our welcome by the Houston police, we spent a few days driving around Texas in the greater Houston area. We had heard there were families camping, either in unauthorized or authorized campgrounds. So we made the rounds, and we came upon two families in this campground. We saw one car had Ohio plates, and one had Michigan plates. As usual, I was writing notes by candlelight, and I wrote about the discovery of Jim and Bonnie Alexander and their two children, Jennifer and Matthew. We knew these weren't weekend campers. This is a very extremely well lived in situation. Platform was built. It said these people had been here for a long time. We ended up moving in next to the family, spent almost a week with them. Learned early on that their house was foreclosed on in Michigan after Jim lost his job in a salt mine. At that point, there were still jobs in Texas. They were begging for workers to come down and work in the oil fields. So they packed up the car and they headed south. And then hard times hit Texas. Jim got laid off, the family ran out of money, and they ended up in a tent. This is a big story in some place like America. This is the briefest of overviews. The short version is Jim had been a Marine in Vietnam. Remember, Vietnam was not that long before this. This was 1983. It wasn't that many years earlier that he was living in tents in Vietnam, and it brought back a lot of those memories. He was really depressed by having to move the family into a tent. But they had no choice. They were out of money. There wasn't much help for the family. If they were going to survive, they were going to have to be creative. This is one of the most powerful stories in our book. They're trying to survive, but also have life that goes on as it would if they were in a house. The kids were in school. They were getting great grades. Jennifer and Matthew had a puppy. But when we showed up, there was no food. They had a cooler that was nearly empty. Now, Jim had told us, I'm not going to let my kids starve. He said I'd hold up a food store if need be. In the end, he never had to do that, we found out later. And he's glad he didn't have to. But that's how he was feeling. That's how desperate these people were. And if you judge him holding the gun here, just ask yourself, as I do, what would I do in that situation? I don't know. For about a year, I exchanged letters with Bonnie back and forth. And then when our first book came out, I sent them a book, and it was returned to sender. In 1995, when Bruce Springsteen called, I tried to find this family, but do you know how many Jim and Bonnie Alexanders there are in America? Okay, we're going to flash forward here. 2009, I did find the family. Using the internet, much easier to find people these days. Unfortunately, Bonnie had passed away just a few months before. But I went to Michigan with Michael and Ron Wyman, the filmmaker who was documenting us. And as our new book has the chapter title, Home Sweet Home. No more tent. Crossed the tent out. The family had gone back to Michigan. They'd rebuilt their lives slowly, but were profoundly affected by what had happened to them. It's the mentality that I saw in my grandparents about the Great Depression. But man, we had a good time, and it was great catching up. As I said in an earlier show, the story of this family is the most powerful in the book because it walks through how they clung together and how they made it. We can learn a lot from them. Michael had Matthew and Jennifer hold up a picture from our first book, and then he recreated the picture. These are close-ups of Jennifer and Matthew. Okay, going back in the time, we're back in 1983. After we left the family, we, of course, as I mentioned in an earlier show, went to that slave camp. And it was quite an experience. These are only a few grab pictures Michael took. This is the camp operator screaming at us as he lunged for Michael's throat. We escaped. As I said, it's a crazy story, and we tell it in the new book. We drove on, and then I documented Michael documenting this man sleeping beneath a stairwell. And this is the picture that appeared in our first book. Then we headed west. Our road was getting shorter. We didn't have much time left. We worked rail yards, and we saw this train. I got out and talked to the engineer. I forget what I asked him. I forget what he said. Somewhere in here is where Michael took the cover photograph for our first book. Then we headed to the border. We went to El Paso. We weren't quite sure what we'd find. Our instincts told us to go down there. We documented people crossing the border. Some men don't like their photograph being taken. We'd heard about this rally, the communist rally that was going to happen. And so we crossed over into Ciudad Juarez and started documenting it. We ran into a photographer from the El Paso paper, Carlos Rosario, and he invited us on top of the bus. So we rode with him and took pictures. There was a lot of economic dislocation in Mexico. The peso had fallen. So you had this huge turnout of the communists. This is, of course, before the Juarez today is known as the capital of drug killings, but it's always been a tense place. Carlos got me mid-jump coming off the bus. We'd heard about Americans coming to Mexico, people who lost their jobs and were surviving because the peso was so devalued, it was very cheap to live there. When I first saw Jim, he reminded me of a character from the Beat Traven novel made into a movie, Treasure of Sierra Madre. Jim had driven out of the Midwest looking for work. He came to Texas. In San Angelo, his car broke down. He abandoned it, ended up here, crossed the border. He was paying $2 a night for this hotel room. He sold his blood plasma over in El Paso for $18. He could see a movie for 75 cents. Food was like a couple bucks a day. He did day haul labor in El Paso when he could get that kind of work. But it was really a sad existence. We ended up going to the hobo jungles in El Paso, and these are some of the writing on the concrete under the underpasses. This man has a warning to other hobos, a little misogynistic, and then the last one about going to California. That's where we were headed. So we were a little freaked out. Time was running out. Did we really have the story we wanted? Were we getting it right? We both felt we didn't have enough. There was a lot of tension between us, stupid tension. But it wasn't us, it was the story. I'll tell you more about that in the next show. We met a couple that was going to teach us a very valuable lesson.